San Diegans accomplish great things every day. We care about our neighbors and our community. We are proud of our diversity. We are resilient. We hold our leaders accountable. We live in one of the most dynamic cities in America, the San Diego Union-Tribune, telling San Diego's story for more than 150 years.
Hello, I'm Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Brian Clark, a Vasiliadis Director of USD's Humanities Center.
USD, including the College of Arts and Sciences and the Humanities Center, is proud to be the presenting sponsor for the 2023 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. This is the festival's second year on campus and the fourth year of our partnership with the Union-Tribune.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables us avid readers to come together as a community alongside renowned authors from all over the world and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and meaningful themes.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across disciplines, and equips students to solve complex problems in a variety of ways.
So on behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the festival.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the San Diego Festival of Books virtual experience. I am John Evans, co-owner of Diesel, an independent bookstore with locations in San Diego and Los Angeles. Diesel strives to promote independent voices and foster a community between readers and writers. As a writer and poet, it is a pleasure to lead a conversation with Maggie Smith on her latest book, You Can Make This Place Beautiful. Maggie Smith is a renowned writer, poet, and educator whose work has been widely published and recognized with numerous awards. Her latest book, You Can Make This Place Beautiful, is a memoir about her journey to rediscover herself and start a new life. In our conversation, we'll explore her story about loss and redemption, the power of love, and the importance of finding your own way in the world. So let's dive in to learn more about Maggie Smith. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, thanks for doing this with me.
My pleasure. Your book is beautiful, so you succeeded in making a beautiful thing.
Okay.
You made that place beautiful. Do you want to describe just a little bit about what generated this book? Your other books have been books of poetry. This is a memoir of sorts. And tell people a little bit about how that came to be.
Yeah. It's funny. I don't have like an elevator pitch for this book. I don't have like the short, sweet synopsis. And I was talking to a friend about this recently, and I thought, well, it's really about my adult life, like my personal life, my professional life. And perhaps if I had an elevator pitch or a short, sweet synopsis for my entire adult life, that would mean I was living a little bit too small. So maybe it's good that I don't actually have like a 2-sentence Cliff Notes version of my adult life. I think that's a good sign. But the book, when I sat down to write this book, I thought the central question of the book was what happened to my marriage. And so I thought naively and very optimistically that if I devoted a year of full-time writing and a lot of empathy and curiosity and attention to the unraveling of my marriage, that by the end of the writing experience and therefore the end of this book, I would have it figured out. I would have that mystery solved. And I don't know how far into the book I wrote before I realized that is not the central question of this book. It's not really what happened to my marriage. I think it's sort of what happened to me in my adult life. Like, where did I go? How did I allow my life to shrink in areas that it should not have been shrinking? And so it ended up being more a kind of excavation of self. And if it's like if a midlife crisis feels sort of like a disappearing act, I feel like this book is more of a reappearing
Yes.
act. You know, it's sort of how do I get back to the person I know I can be in my adult life, both for myself, for my writing, for my kids, for the other people in my life. And so that's really what this book ended up being, although it didn't quite start out that way.
Yeah. It's an interesting, it's not really a memoir. You even mentioned this in there because I should say that the book is so generous in so many different directions, and I think part of that comes from you being a poet. But we
Mhm.
can talk about that a little later. Um, I always think that midlife crises are where someone reaches the end of where they thought they were heading. Now
Mm.
it may be because they've achieved something, or it may be because they haven't achieved something, and then they kind of have two choices. They can kind of like go back,
Mhm.
kind of not deal with it and just act out, and get the red sports car or whatever. Um, or they can sort of reevaluate what it is that has gone wrong. Um, and ultimately, that looking back doesn't necessarily tell you where you are right now, anyways, right? Because you've developed a whole life, you've developed all these responsibilities, and in your case, you have two children. And so it seemed like the first part of the book was the first 100 pages were that kind of looking, why did you separate? Why did you, what happened? And then after that, it's a recognition that, oh, I actually just have to rediscover myself and how do I go forward with what I have, with responsibilities I have, and try and disentangle or exorcise the negative stuff that has happened from the wreckage of my marriage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's probably, and I think you're right about the first third of the book, which is probably why recording the audiobook on day one was so hard.
Yeah.
You know, day two, not that bad. Day two, day three, great. Day one was tough. And I think you're right. It's because the first 100 pages are really the sort of reckoning with the wreckage. And then the rest of the book is me sort of crawling my way out of it.
Well, I think we have a habit of figuring out we want to go back or snap things back to a grid that is natural, right?
Mhm.
It's like when you lose a child or miscarriages, which you talk about in the book. People think that's not natural, but all these things happen, and they
Right.
happen, quote, naturally, but they aren't part of the natural order of things. And so people want to shoehorn themselves into the natural order that they were given by the society or their relationship or whatever, their families. And but that isn't actually natural, and it isn't natural to the individual person. I mean, one thing that I just love throughout this book is when you return to these loving memories of your children, their particularity is so evident, and they are so
Mm.
adorable in the things they say and so creative in the things they say, right? And part of what you lose as an adult sometimes, or you can lose, is shrinking yourself to being less than who they are. In some ways, they're examples to you on how to be, right? And
Yes.
and then how to rediscover that in yourself. And I should say that the book is has these different not themes, these different strains, these different structures. Like
Yeah.
sometimes there are poets like Robert Duncan is one who has, these long arcing series of poems that go throughout their whole life that'll appear in different books. And so you have these, there's the play, there's the note on things, there's these questions. And these different elements um, keep the book very open. It's a very spacious book. I mean, not only on the page, but it allows you to breathe when you're reading it because it's very emotional what you're talking about. But I don't know how you and your editor came up with that structure, but it is definitely up, and that's part of the poetic aspect of the book is that openness,
Yeah. And there's a lot of white space
which is
in this book.
great.
And I
Yeah.
think that's the poet in me, which is, as a poet, what I like to do in poems is hand the reader something and then step away. Like, I don't actually need to hold your hand and walk you through it. I don't need to explain it. exposition is the enemy of lyric. Like, you really don't want to be getting in there and being like, what I mean by this is. You want to be able to hand them a detail, an image, a metaphor, and let that thing release meaning. And so the reader gets to have that experience of discovery for themselves without you getting in the way and kind of like butting in and narrating the whole thing for them. And so when I was working on this book, I knew it would be in vignettes. I knew the individual pieces would be small, mostly because I'm a poet and I think small. I'm a whittler.
Yes.
Whenever I write anything, the longer I work on it, the shorter it gets, which is sort of a problem when you're trying to write a memoir. And you have like
Yes.
a page or word count that you're trying to reach. And every time you open the Word document, the words go down instead of up. That's kind of a problem.
That's funny. That's funny.
But that's the way I work. I like to kind of reduce things to the sort of like most essential bits and then hand that to the reader. And the white space, I love that you said that, because that really is meant to be processing space. I'm handing you a 1-sentence chapter, and it like looks very small, but it weighs a ton. And so I'm just going to hand you this tiny anvil that's very, very small and very, very heavy. And then I want you to have that page of white space in which to kind of breathe and sit with that before you flip and move on to the next bit. So we're not just sort of rushing headlong through all of these, small but heavy pieces. And so all of these different strands, the questions, the notes on narrative itself, the quotes from other writers, the flashbacks, I wrote them all separately and completely out of order. And then basically, like, I assemble a book of poems. I color coded each strand, got a color. So I just got out my kids' markers, printed everything out. And I don't know what pink was. Something was pink. It might have been questions, and just a swipe on the top of the page. And then I shuffled so that a color wouldn't disappear for too many pages. And each of those kind of breadcrumb trails would be traceable without one kind of dropping away for too long. And then once I got it all assembled, I would shuffle through again and say, oh, actually, no, I think I need more pink back here. I think I need another blue. Or it was completely organic.
I know that like William Blake, for example, his plates, he would switch them all around and move them in different ways. And I always think about that with the making of a book of poems, is how do you place one poem, which is meant to be one poem. Sometimes people are writing a series of poems for a particular thing, but otherwise, if you presume that all these poems were written at different moments over some period of time, it could have been 20 years. How do you place them next to each other, and for what end? And so the whole book feels like a sort of musical dance, like a choreography. And then at the same time, it seems like a toolkit. So that if you were going through this process, whether it's a process of divorce in this case, or the grief, which is also divorce, but and loss, any of those kinds of things, almost any page that you pick, and certainly any section, some of which are a few pages long, you could turn to and come back to and reference and absorb. Because I think there's this tension, and you talk about it in the book, about narrative. You're struggling with narrative because the natural impulse is like I said in the first part, to find sort of causative agents, like, as opposed to establishing new agency. And what you've kind of done is come up with new agency for yourself. And you had to go through a process of sorting through. But ultimately, there isn't certainly not one strand that is causative of what's happened with your life. And it's all just complicated. And that's a very poetic sensibility. It's also not how psychology usually works, which is often looking for causative things. But you include some of your therapy in there, and it seems like your therapist, or maybe one of your therapists, I'm not sure, but one of your therapists is waiting. And I thought that was really interesting, for the therapist to just wait for you to get to this particular recognition about yourself.
Yep.
And a lot of memoirs and about divorce memoirs or something, not that that's a genre, but they're people telling that story of themselves, focus a lot on the person that is no longer there. And in a way, you seem to be trying to extricate yourself from that problem, along with a whole bunch of other problems that you're facing when that happens, when a divorce happens with your children. How does that happen? How do you process the things that have been damaging in the relationship? And
Hmm.
anyways, it's a really beautiful and rich and generous book. I just have to keep saying this about your book as a
I'm
reader
so
to
glad
have.
you enjoyed it. I'm so glad you
And
enjoyed it.
the one other thing was that I thought at the beginning that I felt like, oh, this is a book for women. And then
Mm,
then I realized, no, it's not. It's
yeah.
good for anybody. Yeah. And
I
was that
think,
part of your intent? Did you have a reader in mind when you were doing it?
no, not really. I mean, not really. Uh, I think the reader I envisioned is the reader of my poetry, probably, and I don't really think of that as being a woman necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, I do think, I was probably writing to someone around my age.
Hmm.
Like, we're going through this stuff, right? A lot of the things I'm writing about in this book are really midlife problems. Like, they feel like specifically like midlife problems. And yet I have heard from people much younger than me and much older than me that the book was enjoyable and useful to them, either because, or someone will say, I wish I had this book 20 years ago when I was going through X, Y, or Z.
Yes.
And I've heard from people much younger than me who, or maybe even aren't partnered yet, who are glad they read it because now they're thinking about how to approach partnership and
Yes.
family in a more
Yes.
intentional way. Like, let's not fall into, so it's sort of a cautionary tale in that way too. Like, here are some things that you might want to think about doing and or not doing in your adult life as you make decisions about yourself professionally and personally, and as a parent and as a partner and as a, whatever your rules are. um, but yeah, I don't think that the ideal reader of this book is a woman, in part because I think a lot of the things I'm talking about in this book have to do with patriarchy. And we can't really solve that problem preaching to the choir.
No. And so I was interested in that at the beginning because I thought, um, is this going to be in this sort of mode? But I think it's a mode you may have been in, So, but I agree completely about the age thing. I don't think it's a matter of age, and I think that poetry in general is also not,
No,
really
not at
right for
all.
an audience. So, you right, and a lot of what you end up speaking to is an identification with like being a fragile human who's faulty, which is true of every person.
All
And
of us. Yeah.
yeah,
All of us.
and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And like
I
not being able to find a neat narrative, I think is like you were saying earlier. And I think like the narrative is that flux is natural. Like, if we're
that's right,
thinking about the natural order of things, the most natural order of things is constant change, which is not
right,
comforting necessarily to think about. But flux and ambiguity and even moral ambiguity, all of those things are completely natural. And so,
that's
and
right.
maybe being a poet puts me in a position where I feel really comfortable with ambiguity
Yes,
and with living in the gray, because that's where you have to be able to live to write poems.
yeah, and I think that this kind of like bringing creative process into life instead of having it in only in crafts of various kinds or arts, um, that's where, to me, that's where everything is. But that resistance to change, which happens whenever you're traumatized, and an attempt to control the narrative, the kind of negative capability of poetry, and the kind of what I call ontological freefall that I think
Uh,
of creative process as being. That is conveyed on the page because what you do is language. So it's a memoir with superpowers. It's got,
Mm.
because it's got the language, dealing with the truth and honesty of the ambiguity of your feelings, and the sources that you're picking. I don't know if you noticed this, but at the beginning of the book, it's exclusively women that you. I don't mean exclusively in a negative sense, but I mean it's solidly women, for
The
the
quotes
first.
from other writers.
Yes, and then
Yeah.
what happens over time is various male authors enter into the picture. All the quotes are fantastic and on point, and evocative, and help allow people to go in, follow their own threads, which is something that I think poetry also does, right? It
Yeah.
gives you back the power of your own imagination to
Oh, I
create the
love
agency you need to live, right? Um, but and then to evoke a kind of open wholeness, which you do by the end of the book,
that.
um,
Mm.
is is such a relief, because it gives people the sense of possibility, right? Because so much of what happens when you're traumatized is a feeling of fatality. Um,
Yeah, I mean, hope is imaginative, right? Like if you can't
yes,
imagine other possibilities, that's what hope is. If you're
yeah,
completely shut down to the idea of your life being different and or better,
right,
different and opening rather than closing or narrowing ways, that is that sort of like closed pessimistic outlook that I think is natural when you go through any kind of sort of traumatic upheaval, right? And so the ability to be like, but maybe there's other things possible. Maybe this is the end of one thing, but not the end of everything,
right,
right? That for me, that was sort of the happy ending. I knew this book would not have a happy, neat, sewn up ending because
yeah,
that would be false. Like I didn't
right,
want to feel like I had to, by the end of the book, have everything sewn up, and then she lived happily ever after, and was, remarried or repartnered, or had figured it all out, or had solved the mystery, or realized the entire thing was a lie, or I didn't know how exactly it would end, but I knew I wanted it to be hopeful, but not false,
right. And so,
right? Like I,
yeah, the whole idea of creative nonfiction, right, is that you don't have to follow the same structure as narrative fiction often does, right? With certain kinds of things happening. And because you're a poet, you're already armed with tools to make something full and satisfying and rich without making it false. Such a
yeah.
scrappy honesty and generosity to the book that people want because it's more real, right? It's actually
And
how life is.
I agree. And I think readers are really smart and they can sniff out like a false catharsis or a forced epiphany for the sake of the page. I think
Yeah,
readers have a detector for that. I know I do when I'm reading a book. I'm like, I don't buy that. Like, I don't think that's how
yeah,
it felt. I don't think that's how it happened. I think it looks nice on the page. I think it would make a nice Netflix show, but I don't think this is how life works. And so,
no,
even the structuring of this book, I knew it was not going to have a sort of like beginning, middle, end where it had a neat arc because that's not how the experience happened. And so, if I was going to be honest in the conveying of the experience, I needed to be able to show how messy it felt. And so that's why all these different strands operate the way they do. Because to me, grief is not linear, healing is
no,
not linear, memory is not linear. None of these things are linear. So it felt like a complete sort of falsification of the experience to sort of overlay a structure onto the lived experience that didn't map and
right.
align. And so I
It's
was like,
very,
okay,
it's
so
very,
we're going to write it in waves.
yeah, it's great. And I mean, to me, it was so, and this is why before we started, I said I enjoyed it so much, is because the structure, the honesty, the sort of diligence to the language and all of that kind of thing is so satisfying, even though what
Mm.
you're witnessing is a lot of pain and a lot of it's also, though, because it's so real and it's so well articulated, it's a kind of redemptive pain. You know, you're feeling someone is coming out the other side without it being tidy. It's not tidy. And a lot of people, as a bookseller, you hear people coming in there saying, "Oh, this is so beautifully written," da, 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 da. But then the ending, oh my God, it just like tied it all up, and you just felt like it was so short, and it didn't really match the wide openness and beautiful language of the earlier part of the novel. The flip
Yeah.
side of that, though, is that so many people are looking for repetition in their reading. So they're looking for certain kinds of tidy answers because everything seems so chaotic, right?
Yes.
And it's always I always kind of uh, wonder, well, is that really what you want? I'm not sure if you want to do that. I feel like you're kind of it's like watching the clothes go round, watching the clothes go round. Um, which
Yeah. Yeah. Like, do you want to be comforted? Do you want to be consoled? Or do you want to be changed?
yeah,
I think people talk about poetry in that way a lot too, where they'll say, I love poetry because I go to poetry for comfort, or I love poetry because I go to poetry for consolation. And I think, well, that's interesting. And I'm glad that poetry can do that for you, but that's not what I go to poetry for. I
no,
don't
me neither.
actually find much comfort in poetry. I find
No.
the poems I feel most moved by are poems that either articulate something I have felt but haven't been able to say myself in short
Hmm.
order, or they sort of move the furniture in my brain out of the sort of grooves in the carpet in such
Yeah.
a way that I can never see or think about that subject, that landscape, that experience the same way ever again, because I'll always be thinking about it through the lens of that person's writing. That's not comforting, right?
No. Yeah.
That changes you. So that's, I guess maybe that's more my hope for not just for this book, but for anything I write, is it may not comfort in a traditional sense, but maybe it'll move the furniture a little bit.
Yes. No, I'm a complete fan of that same thing. I think transformative writing is exactly why I go in there. People will say sometimes this became a thing given our times, like a bookstore as a safe place. I'm like, well, it's
Well,
not really. It's not really
yeah,
a safe place.
yeah,
I mean, it is a safe place. It's welcoming and it's inclusive and it's open and it's celebrating difference and it's all of
yeah,
those
yeah,
things. But it's also celebrating experience, which is messy and
yeah, and sometimes uncomfortable.
very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I also really loved, because I haven't mentioned this yet, the use of music throughout the book. And the because that's also another sort of wellspring that people have, an emotional and unconscious, strong sustaining force in people's lives, and it's sometimes not included. I love it when people include music in novels and where characters have their particular music that they're listening to and everything. And I
Yeah.
really loved your inclusion of that um, throughout, and the way that you've shared that with your children too.
Oh, it's such a huge part of our lives. I mean,
Yeah.
we rarely do anything without listening to music. It's a huge part of our lives. And so it again would have felt strange not to include it.
I don't want you to read it or explain it, I guess, but there's a beautiful thing at near the end of the book, so I don't want to spoil it. But the cento that you have at the end, I'm a big fan of that
Oh, that's the
as a
biggest risk I took in the book.
yes. And I think for people, it's almost outside the book. It's almost like a thing by itself, and yet at the same time, it is the book, right? So,
Yeah.
so this is just one section near the end of the book. Don't skip ahead to it, anybody that's about to read this wonderful book that's so useful to your life and that you have to read. Um, but I just thought that was stunningly beautiful. And
Oh,
also the
thank
I think
you.
it's maybe the page before the book on the material, which is also kind of reiterates a lot of what we've been talking about, is that the changeability of life and not closing it down. You know, the future is uncertain. That's not a negative. It's a
Nope.
possibility. It's a possibility.
Yeah, that reframing is really useful, I think.
Yeah. And that perspective, you achieve perspective in this book, and that perspective is a very generous thing to share with other people.
Goodness, thank you.
So in closing, I just want to thank you, Maggie, for sharing your story of honesty, vulnerability with us. Your book is a powerful testament to the resourcefulness of the human spirit, as I've been talking about. So you can make this place beautiful through the festival's online bookstore, bookshop.org. The link is at the bottom of the screen and available on the festival website. Every book sale supports our indie bookseller partners who foster community among readers and writers. Please donate to the San Diego Council on Literacy, the festival's nonprofit organization supporting literacy for everyone. You can donate through the festival website at sdfestivalofbooks.com and click the Donate tab. This ends our session, but you can continue watching the festival's on-demand videos and live-streamed author panels. All videos are available on sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thank you for sharing your time with us, and please share this video.
A liberal arts education is at the core of the University of San Diego. The liberal arts,
Really cool.
spanning from the humanities and arts to natural and social sciences, enable students to navigate their way in the world and to have the tools to solve complex problems in a variety of ways. There's a lot of evidence that shows a strong liberal arts education prepares you not for your first or your second job, but for your life.
We use our phones to order food, share our stories, and so much more. SDCCU made banking from your mobile device easy too. You can do so much. Get up-to-date account balances, deposit checks, and more, safely and securely, all through the convenience of your smartphone. Get all of this and more with free checking with e-statements. SDCCU, it's not big bank banking, it's better.